One of the subgenres requested the most on my channel is prog. It's the type of progressive psytrance that really focuses on being like EDM-y, and it also tends to focus a little bit less on the actual psychedelic nature of psytrance. Despite that, I think it's a very interesting genre and I actually listen to it quite a lot. So today we're having a look at making a track in the style of Spin Twist, which is a very important and popular label in that type of psytrance. So this is the project that I've laid out for us today. We're going to go through the whole project and at the end I'm going to do a little playthrough. What I want to start out with is the intro though, and what is very important for this type of psytrance is that your intro immediately hooks you into the track. Because this is a more EDM style of psytrance than your traditional psytrance, this is played a lot more in settings outside of a festival. And maybe from a music writing perspective you agree with it or you don't, but this means that you're kind of Spotifying your track, if you would call it like that. You're making sure that once the track starts to play, the listener is immediately hooked in. Now what you'll often find is that it's done through a vocal in the intro. Unfortunately, I did not have a vocal available for this project, but I did have a different musical idea, and that is just this little plug idea here. What you'll see is happening here is that I'm actually not starting the intro from the very start of the project. Usually that's where I start writing my music. I start from the very initial point. But in this project I decided to start after 8 bars so that I could have this little fade in. And I basically could determine the starting position of the track later. I ended up with a starting position of 1 bar, which I'm just using to fade in some reverse reverb. I have the plugs play a little bit early, as you can see from the MIDI clip here. And then it's also layered with this strong impact, which adds a little bit of extra starting power to the initial part of the intro. To give this track as much force as possible right from the start, what I decided to do is also layer in a Reese bass that sounds like this. And for some extra atmosphere, we also have a nice pad, which is evolving and just overall changing a lot to keep it interesting. What I'm really doing to keep this interesting is I'm using a trance gate for some dynamics, as well as a 4-man shift to just keep it moving all the time. So this initial intro idea goes on for 16 bars. As you can see, we also have this other vocal shout that comes in towards the end of it. Again, to just add a little bit of extra texture, a little bit of extra character. And you can hear the massive reverb / delay tail that we have here, which allows it to just fade into the next segment. In the next segment, the Reese bass is taken out and we're going to go into a normal kick and bass segment, which is filtering in. This is actually not going to be the kick and bass that is playing into the drop, and this is actually a common trick that you often hear, where you give the listener the expectation of hearing a rolling kick and bass, but as you can see later in the video, we're actually going into an offbeat kick and bass. Anyway, we're adding some extra effects. As you can see, we have another impact here, we have some sweeps, we have some noise effects. We also see the sequence coming in, which is a bunch of brass taps, which is a very common element. You can see that I'm filtering them in so that they slowly come into play. And this essentially means that they don't have full power before they go into the drop, because this is also going to be one of our main drop elements. So we just want them to have a little bit of extra power when they get into the drop. And removing the higher frequencies is a very easy way of doing that. The final element that sits in here are some vocals. We have this first vocal pad here. This one is also filtering in, and then we have this reverse vocal, which just goes into the next section, which is going to be the pre-drop. Now the pre-drop here consists out of 2 parts. There's a lot of different things that you can do in the pre-drop, and we'll show a different example in a little bit. Now this particular pre-drop is a very common one, which is going to be a fake drop. I'm personally not really a fan of them, but for this type of music, it does really work well. The essence is that you're going to really tone down the energy. Everything that you're building up here is just suddenly going to stop, as you can see from all of the clips. We're then going to go into a drum fill, which you can see right here, and then it looks like the drop is starting, but this is actually filtered kick and bass. And you can see we have another drum fill here. This is on the same track. And that then goes into the actual start of the drop. Keep in mind that you can see the structure up here, so you can actually follow along with the structure to actually see what is happening. So this pre-drop idea is going to sound somewhat like this. And as you can hear, that leads nicely into the drop itself. Now the drop itself, we have our standard kick and bass. What we also have is we have our crashes and little bits of noise in here. This is just there together with some of the bass layers that we're doing to just emphasize different parts of the track. As you can see here, we have some bass layers. We also have this variation here. We again have the brass tap that we saw before, playing the exact same melody that we saw in the intro. This is actually important because I like to switch up the melody every once in a while. And once I do in the project, I'll actually show where that happens. The main thing of interest though is all of the one-shots. As opposed to other types of sidetrends, what you can see is that there's loads of small one-shots. And the way that I make these is just with some Vengeance samples. To be honest, for this project, I couldn't be bothered synthesizing all of those things myself because that takes up a lot of time. And something like the Vengeance sample pack usually comes with some synths. As you can see, there's going to be a massive list of them. In this case, you can see over 200 different sounds that you can just drag into the track. Some of these were initially in a different key, but I just pitched them to the right key, which for this track I decided upon F sharp. And the only real important thing is that you generally keep the rhythm that you're setting up with your kick and bass. So you can see this is an offbeat kick and bass, which means that the kick is playing on the beat, and then the offbeat or halfway in between the two kicks, the bass note starts to play. And you'll see that also for all of the one-shots. You'll see that here as well. And just moving forward to this section, you will again see that that is true. Sometimes though, what I like to do is have a little bit of a bigger stab and then it just plays on the beat itself. That is happening in this case in this fill. This fill is also complemented by another drum fill, and you can see that there's again massive emphasis on the offbeat for all of the elements. This does sometimes go away from the offbeat, but you can see that most of these elements lay on the actual offbeat. A small little tip that I can give you for elements like these, for these drum fills, is you want to keep them as kind of clean and as tight as possible. And you don't really want anything from the drum fill bleeding into your drop. You really just want it to play in the fill and then turn it off so that it all gets a little bit of a tighter feeling. In order to achieve that, what I've done is I've used the utility with -infinite gain. So anytime the drop starts to play, I just turn that on for a little while. So anything bleeding over, any cymbals that might be in here, any reverb that might be in here is just cut off. And you don't have this fill kind of bleeding into the drop itself. Then for the other segments, what will happen is that we just kind of continue the pattern. What you'll see for many cases is that I literally just took some of the one-shots, duplicated them over and ended up with the same stuff. I may have made some variations here. And then usually what happens is that there's one, or in this case, two different kind of rhythmical one-shots that play each bar or sometimes every 2 bars. And that just adds a little bit of extra rhythm. You'll also see some other detail stuff, like we have this other vocal shout coming in here, playing once every 4 bars. But you're essentially slowly building up the energy with all of the different elements that you're adding, up until a point where you really cannot do that anymore, which is where you just go for something like a switch up. Another thing that can help here is a little bit of an extra layer to the bass, something like this. And that just takes the kick and bass from this to something like this. As you can hear, it just spices up the rhythm a little bit away from that standard kind of offbeat rhythm that we have established already. We can see that the same thing is happening in terms of the drums. There's very little elements and they're slowly building up. Overall, as you can see, this part of the track really is just a snare every other beat and then a hi-hat on the offbeat. In this case, a nice big open hi-hat. Your standard kind of 909 open hi-hat. Now quickly looking into the kick and bass itself, there's really not much going on. I wasn't really going to show it, but I know that I'm going to get questions about it. This kick is just one of my kicks from my sample pack. And then the main offbeat bass line is a preset that I'm working on for my upcoming preset pack. The only real interesting thing is that I'm sometimes playing with the mod wheel to just add a little bit of extra movement and just slightly open the filter from time to time. Now, as I said, at some point this slow progression really becomes a little bit boring, and that's where you want to switch things up. The first way that I'm doing it is with a continuous kick and bass pattern. It is actually the same melody from earlier segments. The only difference that you can see is that I've added one extra clip with one extra note that just finishes off the melody and makes sure that it plays on every offbeat. What I've also done is rearrange the brass tabs. This is where we first switch up the melody. And I've also taken all of these small snippets and rearranged those to just get something a little bit more interesting here. The final part that you'll see is that we have this break arp here, which sounds like this. And this is just slowly being introduced to prepare for the breakdown. Now, the breakdowns are actually much bigger thing in prog than in other types of psytrance. As you can see from the structure track here, this breakdown is massively long. In normal psytrance, we don't really get this. We don't really get those type of very long breakdowns. The reason why this works in this subgenre is that it's not really supposed to be like for continuous dancing. What it's more like is like the kind of EDM that you might see at a festival like Tomorrowland or Ultra Music Festival. Now, in my opinion, in those cases, what you'll find is that there's a little bit less like standard dancing that you see in other types of psytrance, and it's more like jumping to the beat. So if you're jumping, you don't want to have that continuously, otherwise you might get tired. You can imagine that as a DJ, you don't want to play the type of music where after half an hour into your set of jumping, everybody leaves because they're just tired of jumping around. It's a different type of dancing, and therefore people need to rest more in between the drop sections. Now, in this case, what I've done is I've started off with that break arp that we heard before. We've added the re-space from the intro again, and then we have this vocal line in here.
This idea that I want to put forth, which is basically an extension of orthodox evolutionary theory as it applies to the question of human origins. And then, having once established that part of the theory, going forward to try and see what kind of implications this revisioning of evolutionary mechanisms might have on contemporary life and the way in which we relate to ourselves and each other.
This is just kind of your standard Alan Watts sample. It's a trove of psytrance, so I decided to put it in here. It then fades nicely into the next segment, which is going to be this vocal line here. This is from the Kashmir pack, and it fitted the track really, really well, so I decided to build the next part of the track around this vocal here. What I'm doing here is I have two different versions of the vocal. One is the main vocal, and this is more of a harmonized version of the vocal. This then leads into the build-up where we have a ton of risers, a whole bunch of different things. The vocal itself is going to be rising. And then we have kick risers, we have this massive snare build here. So everything is there to just really enhance the energy over time and really nicely build up to this point here. So as you've probably already heard, this part of the track is in triplets, and this is another kind of standard trove of this prog style of psytrance. Another very standard thing to do in that style of psytrance is that you have this kind of segmented pre-drop thing here. This is just based on the vocal, and it went really well with the vocal itself, so you get something like this. This is done through some orchestral drums. We have another orchestral fill in here to help with that, going into the drop itself. We have the brass taps again. This is again a key element in the track, and again I've just changed up the melody to make it a little bit different. And we have some effects to make sure that everything transitions nicely and that there's some impacts to the different segments. Then we go into our triplet section. As you can see, we have a different bass line for this. This is just your standard kind of triplet bass. This is again coming from one of the presets that I'm currently working on for the pack. And in this case, what I've done is I've just taken one of the standard presets that I personally also like to use in my own productions and just make sure that the note length is set in a way that it is a triplet note, a 1/8 triplet note, as opposed to your standard 16 note. You can see a little bit of EQing here, and I'll talk also a little bit about the processing on the bass lines. All of the different things that make up the main bass line and all of the little accents and stuff that I'm doing is just going through this one group, which is controlling its volume. It also is applying a little bit of stereo processing, and then it's applying the sidechaining to make sure that it has space for the kick. You can see this part right here is sometimes used in different fills or different sections to just filter out parts of the kick and bass and just distort them a little bit. And then finally we have a linear phase EQ, which I'm using for filtering in and out the bass line. So that's the whole processing chain. It's literally just the preset going through some stereo processing, a little bit of sidechain and a little bit of filtering. And that's, in this case, the triplet bass line together with the kick is going to sound like this. As you can hear, I'm using a few stops, I'm using a few rolls, and I'm using a few melodies just to keep it a little bit more interesting. And you can see later on in the drop, I'm sometimes also using the mod wheel just to open it up again and to again keep it a little bit more interesting than just your standard bass line doing the same thing over and over again. We also have a little bit more of a dubstep bass line in this part. This is just a bunch of samples again from the Vengeance pack. This is just there to create a little bit of a fill and to give a little bit of a pause before we go into the next section of the drop. You can see we're using the same elements also in terms of the one-shots again, and we're using them in the exact same way. The only difference, of course, being that we're generating triplets patterns instead of your standard offbeat pattern. We have a little different segment here where the orchestral drums come through a little bit more. The brass is also playing a different melody here, and the bass line is slightly changing as well. And that then leads into the final segment where we have a little bit of a switch up before going into our rolling kick and bass. Now, it will probably not surprise you that this bassline is also bassline from the preset pack. In this case, it's the pre-processed version. Again, this preset pack is not yet available because I'm still working on it, but it will be available soon. As you can see for this one, in terms of processing, it is just cleanly going into our bass group. So that means that the processing is just going to be the part that we saw before. And again, there's a few layers. I'm sometimes bringing back the offbeat. A very interesting thing to do is not to really have your rolling kick and bass just continuing here, but you just spice it up. Again, here you can see I'm using the offbeat bass, I'm using some of the layers. But then later on in the track, what I like to do is to keep a little bit more of the rolling pattern in there. You can still see that there's some gaps in here where we can have some double kicks, we can have some other things, but we're essentially not really going into the full speed rolling bass line at the start, so that we can slowly again build up the energy as we go into later parts of this drop. Now this drop is again just a few segments. This last part is actually the outro. And you can just see that we're again using the same elements that we've used before. And at the end, it just fades out into silence. Now that's the whole project. That's going to be the whole track. To be honest, I don't plan on releasing it because it's not the type of music that I enjoy releasing. It's not the kind of style that I want to be known for. What I might do is put it up on my Experimenter SoundCloud page. What I'm definitely going to do though is I'm going to render out all of the stems for this project and put them up on my Patreon page. So if you want to explore this project in much greater depth, then you can definitely do so. I might need a little bit of time to figure out exactly how I'm going to do that and how I'm going to place them on there. Patreon does have a file size limit, and I just need to figure out how I'm going to actually put it up there, if I'm going to use a different service, if I'm just going to link the files one by one. So I don't really know how I'm going to do that yet. If this video already is out and the stamps aren't up there yet, then there should hopefully be soon. But what you can expect from that Patreon pack is that I'm essentially going to render out each individual sound, not even the groups. You're just going to get access to all individual sounds with all of the effects burnt in. And the whole goal is that if you drag it into your DAW of choice, the music should actually play back as you hear it right now. Of course, that's with the exception of the mastering. I'm going to take off the mastering before I render out those stems, because the mastering isn't going to work for the actual stems that you're going to hear. Obviously, you don't want to master your stems. But if you want to copy my master chain as well, here you can see the master chain that I'm using. This is the Shadow Hill mastering compressor. You can just copy the settings for this. We have a little bit of a clipper. This is a free clipper that I really like because it includes oversampling. We have a slight bit of EQing for some tonal changes, mainly in the high end. And then we have Boost, which is my maximizer. You can just use any maximizer that you want. Anything that just gets it nice and loud will work. Just make sure that the maximizer that you're using has oversampling enabled and true peak mode as well. So that's going to be the video for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and making sure that you're subscribed. We'll conclude this video with the playthrough of the whole track. I've decided to put in some analyzers so that there's a little bit more stuff that you can look at. But I hope that you enjoyed this playthrough, and I hope that you enjoyed the track.
This idea that I want to put forth, which is basically an extension of orthodox evolutionary theory as it applies to the question of human origins. And then, having once established that part of the theory, going forward to try and see what kind of implications this revisioning of evolutionary mechanisms might have